Okay, so scientific method is something that I know that you've learned year after year, probably since the 4th grade, but we're going to do a quick walkthrough of it. So I prefaced this lecture, if you were in class today, with a little Monty Python video clip, which I'll include in the playlist so you can watch it and you'll understand what I'm talking about. And I was showing that in this video clip, they were actually using the scientific method to try to solve a problem, although there were some major issues with their logic. So the question that they were trying to answer was whether a particular woman was a witch. The background information that they threw in was that she was dressed as a witch. She had the nose like a witch. She had a wart. One of them said she had turned them into a newt. So this was their background information, and their hypothesis, therefore, was that she was a witch. They then went through an entire process where they designed an experiment. Again, a very flawed experiment, but they said, well, let's see. Wood, if witches burn, because you burn them at the stake, because they're made of wood. And wood floats, so if she's a witch, she should float. But since other things can float, they took it a step further and said, well, a duck floats, and so if she weighs the same as a duck, she'll float, and therefore she will be a witch. And so this was their experiment. Again, it had some issues. Normally we would then perform our experiment, analyze our data, and draw a conclusion. All right, so let's start with our hypothesis. So a hypothesis, as you know, is an educated guess. We're going to use a sample experiment for our class right now. We're going to say that, suppose your friend says that listening to music helps them study. They do better on their tests because they listen to music. And some of you may study while you listen to music. Other people may not. So let's just say this is what they think. What kind of experiment might we use to test this? And so in class we came up with a couple of experiments. We said we could divide the class in half. One group would listen to music, the other group wouldn't listen to music, and then how would we know if the studying was better with or without music? We would actually give them a test at the end of the week, and we'd see which group performed better, or if either group performed better. So, hypothesis. So you might have a hypothesis that listening to music does help you study. Somebody else may have a hypothesis that it does not. Here are two specific kinds of hypotheses. So the first kind of hypothesis that I want to walk you through is called an if-then hypothesis. An if-then hypothesis basically says if, and then a generality. The generality is basically what you would have said is your hypothesis originally. For example, in our case, if music helps you study. That's what we think, so that's the if. The then is the specific experimental results that you would expect that would support it. So just because it has if and then doesn't mean that it's a good hypothesis. Keep that in mind. So a good hypothesis would look like this. It doesn't have to be exactly this, but notice here what I have. If listening to music helps you study more efficiently. So here's our if. Listening to music helps you study. That's basically our whole hypothesis. The whole point of the then part is the then is going to tell me what your experiment's going to be. How are you going to know listening to music helps you study? And here's our experiment. I can clearly see it here. You're going to have a group that's going to listen to music during their study time, another group that's not going to listen to music, and we're going to see who performs better on the weekly test. So an incorrect hypothesis. You would not say, if you listen to music, then you'll do better on the test. Or if you study without music, you'll do better on the test. You would say, if listening to music helps you study. That's the entire hypothesis in your if. And then the then part would be the specific experiment. Then the group that listened to music will perform better than the group that did not. And so that is the basic setup for an if-then hypothesis. This used to be really big on the AP exam, but nowadays, there's another kind of hypothesis that they ask for more often, and it's called a null hypothesis. Now, null hypothesis kind of sounds silly because your whole point of your experiment is that if you were doing this as a science fair project, you would hope that the group listening to music did better because that would be really cool. That would be, you think listening to music helps you study, so you want one group to do better. Then you've got really cool results. The null hypothesis makes it sound like you don't believe that the experiment's going to work. But there is a really important reason for using null hypothesis, and it has to do with statistics. So think of it this way. We split the class in half. One group listens to music, one group doesn't listen to music. The group that listens to music, at the end of the week, they take a test, And the average score on the test with the group with music is 85%. And the group that does not listen to music, their average score is 83%. Now, here's the question. Was there a difference? Did music help? Well, technically, they did have a higher score. But is it enough of a higher score, and that's an average anyway, that we can really say there was a difference? So with an if-then hypothesis, would you support it or reject it? It's kind of hard to say. Would you say, you know, that they did do better? Would you say they didn't do better? I mean, where do you cut it off? In other words, everybody might agree that this is not enough. But what if it was 80 and 85? Would that be enough? Or what if it was 70 and 85? Would that be enough? Like, where would you draw the line and say that it made a difference? So that's what we're going to learn later this week, is how we can use statistics to determine if there was a difference or not. But the easiest kind of hypothesis to use for a statistical analysis like this is what's called a null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is always the same. You will say there will be no significant difference. You can actually you don't even have to use the word significant. I like to use it because in this case, for example, there may not have been there was a difference, but it wasn't significant. But it is okay if you were to just say there will be no difference between the grades of the students who listen to music and those who do not listen to music. So a null hypothesis, null means like zero, none, zero. Your null hypothesis is basically going to say that there's going to be no difference between, and then you name your groups. Obviously, you're kind of hoping in your experiment that this hypothesis is rejected. You kind of want this hypothesis to fail, because if your null hypothesis fails, it'll mean that there was a difference and there was a change. And not only that, but this one doesn't only fail if music helps, it would also fail if music hurts. So you don't have to say that you think music is going to make it better or music's going to make it worse. You're basically, if music does anything at all in either direction, this hypothesis will fail because there will be a difference. And the difference can be in either direction. So this will come back later, but that's how you write a null hypothesis. All right, running through the parts of a controlled experiment very quickly. So our independent variable, sometimes called the manipulated variable, this is the thing in the experiment that you are changing. So in our experiment, with the music, our experimental group would be the group that listened to the music. They received that change. Our control group is our comparison group. They're the same in every other way the experimental group, but they do not receive the change. So our group not listening to music would be our control group. We also should be careful about controlled variables. I don't like the word controlled variables because what ends up happening is people mix up control group and controlled variables. So I'll ask on a test to give me the control group, and someone will give me a controlled variable instead. So I kind of like the word constant better. But the controlled variables are things that you would want to be the same for all of your groups. So your experimental group receives the change, the control group doesn't receive it, and your controlled variables are the things that you would want to be the same, which we're going to go through a sample in 1 second of this. So I'll give you an example. One quick thing, if you were given data and you were asked, they gave you an experiment and they actually gave you the data in a table and they graphed it and everything for you and asked you questions. And if they asked you, one of the questions they asked you was what was the independent variable, I don't know that I've ever seen a table where the independent variable wasn't on the left side of your table. The dependent variable is typically going to be the right. The labels on your table are usually your independent variable. Because think about it, if you were going into the lab, you would already have your table set up. You would be filling out the left side, and you wouldn't know yet until you actually did the experiment what's on the right side. So one way to identify the independent and dependent variable if you're given a table, the independent variable should be what's on the left, or if it's one of these tables where the labels are up here, your independent variable is going to be this up top, and what was filled in as data is going to be your dependent variable. So just a little helpful note there. The dependent variable, like I said, that's what you're actually going to measure. That's your data. You might have multiple dependent variables. You can only test one independent variable. If I want to see if music helps you study, and I give you guys different music, or one group has music and one doesn't, but one group studies for 2 weeks and one group only gets a week, that's not going to work. I have two independent variables now. I've got the amount of time they studied and the music, so that's a problem. But you can have multiple dependent variables. I could, for example, in this case, I have a sample if we were doing how fertilizer helps plants. I might measure multiple things. I might measure the number of leaves, how quickly they sprout. Does the fruit taste better? Do they grow taller? There might be multiple things I look at, and I might choose a fertilizer depending on, what specifically I want. If I'm a farmer, I don't necessarily care about my plant growing tall. I want my plant to make the most corn, or maybe the sweetest corn, because I'm going to get the most money for it. So I might be measuring different things as a dependent variable. All right. So moving on, this is a last slide here. The last thing we did was we summarized. So I said, what if we broke our students into 3 groups? One group listens to classical music, one group listens to rock music, one group listens to no music, and at the end of the week, they all take the same tests. We're going to really quickly label all the parts of this experiment. So first, our independent variable, the thing we changed, this would be our music. We had classical music, rock music, and no music. All of that would fall under our independent variable, or the thing that we were changing. Our dependent variable, what were we measuring? How are we going to know the effect of the music? Is the test. Technically, not just the test, but the grade that people get on this test is going to be our dependent variable. Now, and I apologize for shortening these, experimental group, that's what my EG represents here. That's not an official abbreviation, it's just mine. The experimental group, that's the group that received the change. So in this particular experiment, my experimental group, I have 2 of them, classical music and rock music. In fact, I would probably want to provide them with a specific playlist, because rock could be lots of things. One group could be listening to Led Zeppelin, and another group could be listening to Metallica, or Megadeth, or whatever. So I might even specify a specific playlist. My control group would be the group that listened to no music. I removed the variable altogether. And then CVs, that's what I intended to be my controlled variables. So maybe I control the playlist they listen to. Maybe I control how much time they are given to study. Because if one group studies longer, maybe the location where they study, definitely the test they take, it's got to be the same. And probably they should want to take that test at the same time of day. I probably want to start with students that are all in the same class, that have the same the average grades to begin with. So there's lots of things we could go through. But these are control variables, or your constants. These would be all the things that you'd want to be the same for everybody, so that you could be certain that if there was a difference, it would definitely be because of the type of music and not because of something else. Hypothesis. If-then hypothesis, again, would be if listening to music helps you study, then the groups listening to classical and rock music will do better than the group listening to no music. Or maybe you would be more specific, if listening to classical music helps you study, then the group listening to classical music will perform better on the test than the groups listening to rock or no music at all. And then our null hypothesis, again, will be that there will be no statistical difference, or there is no difference between the scores on tests when listening to classical, rock, or no music. No difference. That's our null hypothesis. So that's a summary of what we talked about in class today. And then we did some practice problems on an if-then worksheet as a group, and we started talking about those.